For today's Friday afternoon training session, I'm going to give a presentation on the new Android data binding library, as well as the model view Viewmodel design pattern on Android. And we're going to be building a simple Twitter application here that's going to connect to a test account that I've created for this presentation and show us our home timeline. I've included links to my GitHub that has the source code for this project, as well as a link to the blog where I initially read about the data binding library and got this example code from, so definitely check that out. If you're unfamiliar with the data binding library on Android, it basically gives us a very easy way to associate our views in our application to our model objects and display the data in the model in those views. And even more powerfully, it allows us to update our views based on the underlying data model changing. So we're going to see that in this sample code, but the first thing we need to do is set up our dependencies for data binding. So if you look at your top level Gradle file, we're going to need to include this class path for the data binder. Then in our application Gradle file, we're going to apply the com.android.databinding plugin. And once you set up those two things, you're ready to use data binding in your app. While we're here in the Gradle files, I also want to show a couple of the libraries that we're going to be using in this project, as well as how we're doing authentication with Twitter. If you download the sample code, it's not going to come with this twitter4j.properties file because it contains the access keys for that Twitter account. So you're going to need to create this file and put it in the root directory of the project, or else the test code will not work. And this file is very simple. It's just key value pairs that you can get from apps.twitter.com for the Twitter account that you want to connect. And then just replace these keys with the actual keys that you get from that website. And once you have those set up, our app will load those keys from this properties file and then let us use them in our application. And that's going to be used by the Twitter4j library to do authentication and connect to our timeline. So just if you want to use this app on your own, make sure you create this file and set up the keys appropriately. If you have any issues, just let me know. And I'm also going to take a look at some of the libraries we're going to be using here. We've got the standard Android support libraries and our recycler view that's going to be displaying our home timeline. As I mentioned, we're going to be using the Twitter4j library to connect to Twitter and get our feed. We're also going to be using the glide library, which is an image loading library for Android. It's very similar to Picasso. If you've used that before, the code will look very familiar. So now that we have our dependencies set up for data binding, as well as included some libraries that we're going to need in this project, let's talk a little bit more about some of these classes and a little bit more about the model view Viewmodel pattern. So the model in this case is going to be something called the Twitter4j status object. So that's going to be what's returned by the Twitter4j library when we fetch our home timeline. And our view model in this case is going to be this status class that we have created. Basically, it's the stand-in between our underlying model, which is the Twitter4j status object, and our view, which is going to be our recycler view that shows our home timeline. And basically the purpose here is to directly relate our underlying model to our view. So in our view, we're going to be displaying the person's name who tweeted, their screen name, the text of the tweet, and we're also going to be showing their avatar. So this is a pretty simple class right now. It simply has a constructor with these required parameters to set our name, screen name, the status text, and the image URL, and a couple of getters here. Next, we're going to take a look at the status marshaller class. This is going to convert our Twitter4j objects that we receive from the Twitter4j library into our Viewmodel status object. So this is a pretty simple class as well. We're going to basically take a list of Twitter4j statuses, iterate through them, and create a new list of status objects. And we're going to be calling this Marshal function on each Twitter4j status. If we come down to this Marshal function, you can see it pulls the user out of our Twitter4j status object, and then simply creates our own status object by pulling out the username, the screen name, the text of the tweet, and their profile image. So now that we have a way to convert our underlying model of the Twitter4j object into our status view model, let's take a look at the adapter for our recycler view that's going to display these statuses. So if you've worked with recycler views before, none of this should come as too much of a surprise here. This is pretty standard. We have a new instance here, which is going to create our new list of statuses, and it's going to need to create a marshaller as well, because this is going to take a list of Twitter4j objects that we're going to fetch in our main activity, and we need a way to convert those into our status class. As you can see here, we have our constructor that simply takes the list of statuses and our marshaller that we created in our new instance function. We have the creation of our view holder. So we're going to be using this status item layout. Going to go into that next, and that's actually going to be the first part where we're going to be using data binding. So far we haven't used any of the data binding functionality, but that's going to start coming in when we take a look at this layout file. We have our onBind view holder function here. Pretty simple stuff. I'm just going to get our status and bind it to our view. And then we have our set statuses function, which, as I said, is going to take a list of Twitter4j status objects. It's going to clear our current list and then add the new list using our marshaller class to marshal those Twitter4j statuses into our Viewmodel status class. Now let's take a look at some actual data binding code. We're going to do that by looking at this status item layout file. There's going to be the view in our recycler view that holds the screen name, the username, their avatar, and their tweet. So the first thing you're going to notice is we have this new section in our layout file called the data section. And it's going to be where we set up our variables that we're going to use later in our layout file to display our model. We've got two fields here for the variable that we want to use. We have to give it a name, and we call it status, and we're going to give it the class path of our view model. And if we scroll down here, we'll see how this is used. So here you can see the status name, the screen name, and the status text. And if you notice in the text portion of these fields, we're going to be referencing this variable name that we created earlier in our data section called status. And we're also going to be referencing this name. And the way it knows how to bind these is it's using our status class here. So when we say status.name, Android's going to generate a go-between class that's going to reference this name field in our Viewmodel object. And we're going to take a look at how it actually binds those and does that in the next section here by looking at our status view holder. Now that we've set up the data binding in our layout file, let's take a look at our status view holder. And this is going to be where the actual binding takes place and associates our Viewmodel status object with the view that we want to display it in. So when you're doing data binding, Android's actually going to do a pass on your layout files first and create some classes for you. And in this case, it's going to create our status item binding class. So if we look at our status item layout file, remember we set up this new data section and we gave it a class path to our Viewmodel status object. So when you're building the app, it's actually going to look at this and then create the appropriate class for you. And since our Viewmodel is named status, it's going to create the status item binding. So once that class is created, we're going to actually use it here in our view holder to associate our Viewmodel with the view. So you can see when we create our view holder, we're going to instantiate this binding object by calling databindingutil.bind item view. And this is going to let us use this item view to display whatever data we set from our model. And we do that with this bind function. So when the adapter wants to bind our view holder to some data, we're going to call the bind function in our status view holder, which is going to call binding.setStatus in our status item binding object. And what this does is it associates our Viewmodel status object with the item view that we passed in originally, and then it's going to display that data in that view for us. So before I show a demo of what we've done here so far, let's take a look at two more classes: the Twitter consumer interface as well as the main activity. So the Twitter consumer is basically just an interface for anything that wants to consume data from the Twitter client. I'm not going to go into the Twitter client here too much. This is basically just the way that we use Twitter4j to fetch our statuses from the Twitter API. So you can take a look at this, but we're not going to go into it too much here because we want to focus more on the data binding side. But the Twitter consumer interface is basically what lets us consume the data returned from that client. So if we take a look at our main activity here, it's going to implement this Twitter consumer interface because it's going to be consuming that feed that we get from the client. When we create our main activity here, we just have a simple layout file that has our recycler view. We're going to create our recycler view here. We're going to set up our adapter, and we're also going to create our Twitter client. When we resume the app, we're going to connect to Twitter, and from the consumer interface here, when we're connected, we're going to fetch the home stream. And once the home stream is fetched, we're going to call this add to home stream function. And that's simply going to set our statuses on the adapter. So if you remember in our adapter, we have the set statuses function that will clear the current data and then marshal all of the Twitter4j statuses into our status view model. So now that that's all set up, let's take a look at our actual application we've got so far. So if we pull it up here, you can see that looks like we bound our data successfully. We've got the name of the tweeter, we've got the username, we've got the status, but you'll notice that we're missing the profile image. And that's because of a limitation with the data binding library that we're going to look into next. Alright, let's take a look at a way of displaying images that actually will not end up working. So let's try this. Let's add another variable to our status item layout for glide. Like I said, we're going to be using glide for loading images. Let's take a look at our image view here. We're going to try and add this code where we use glide to load our status image URL into this, which is going to be our view. And if we try and build this, let's see what happens. Now you'll get an error from data binding. And basically this error is happening because there are some operators we cannot use in our code that's contained in our layout file. So if you look at the data binding guide here, you can see the expression language that you can use in your layout file code. Now, Most of these operators are pretty simple here, looks a lot like Java, but there are a couple of operators that are missing, and one of those is this. You can't actually reference the view using this in your layout file. You also cannot instantiate new objects in your code that's contained in your layout file. So we're going to have to take a different approach to actually show that image view. Alright, let's take a look at the approach that we're going to need to use to actually load our avatar images into our app and display them. So you can see I've removed our glide variable from our data section, and I've modified the image view to use this app image URL tag and pass the status.imageURL in here. We've also added a new class called data binder. So one of the powerful features of the Android data binding library is the fact that it allows you to set up custom bindings. So you can see this annotation, binding adapter image URL, and that references this new app image URL tag that we've added to our image view. So when the binding library does a pass through our code, it's going to see this app image URL tag. It's also going to see that we've set up this annotation for the image URL tag to do a custom binding with it. So whenever it goes to bind the data, it's going to call this function that we've created here. And the first parameter is going to be the image view that we are going to display our avatar in, and that's going to be provided for us automatically. Then we have this string URL parameter, and that's going to be obtained from the status image URL that we set up in our layout file. Now once we've set that up, it's very easy to actually set our image view into our application. So we're going to get the context from the image view that was passed in, and then we're going to do a simple glide call here to load that URL into our image view using the context that we obtained from this image view. And once we have that set up, that's all we have to do. We have our custom binding now, and when the app runs, it's going to call this setImageURL function to do the binding instead of trying to do the default binding. And when we run the app now, we'll see that our Twitter feed now is successfully loading and binding the avatar images for us. And as I said, custom bindings are very powerful because it gives you the ability to modify what you're binding on the fly. So you can also do things like set custom typefaces for fonts here. If you had a text view being passed in, you could set up a tag here for font or something like that, and then you could set up a tag called app font on your text view, and then you could set the font when you're doing the binding. So this opens up a lot of possibilities to do custom view binding and get kind of custom view implementations without actually having to create custom view classes, which is very nice and also a very powerful feature. Now let's add a little more functionality to this app by allowing the user to see quoted statuses on the timeline. So you can see here we've got a new layout element. It says tap to load tweet. When we click it now, it's just going to give us a snack bar. So I'm not actually going to show the quoted status yet. I'm just going to show how to set up this on-click handler using the data binding library. You'll also notice that this is dynamically displayed based on if the status you're looking at actually has a quoted status associated with it. So now that we've seen the demo, let's take a look at the code and see how this is done with the data binding library. Let's start by looking at the status item layout file. So you can see we've added a new variable to our data section called handler. And we've also referenced a new class here called clickHandler. The clickHandler is a pretty simple class. We're going to take a status in, We're not using this yet because we're not actually going to display the quoted status, but we will be using that shortly. And we have a simple onClick function that just shows our snack bar that says the item was clicked. Now if we go back to our layout file, you can see this new layout that's going to show our quoted status. We added an onClick handler that references this handler variable from our data section and the onClick method. And we also have this visibility with a ternary expression inside of it to either show or hide this relative layout based on if our status has a quoted status. So if we look at our status object, we've added this new quoted status to it. It's allowed to be null, and if it is null, we'll say it does not have a quoted status. If it isn't null, then it does have a quoted status, and this layout will be displayed. Now, one pitfall here is the fact that we have this ternary expression in our visibility field, and you don't really want to be adding too much logic here when you're doing your data binding, because this makes it very hard to debug when you're running the code. Another approach here would be to do a custom binding for the visibility and set it that way instead. But we're going to go with this method just to show that you can do things like this with the data binding library, but definitely be careful, because if you're adding too much logic here, it becomes very difficult to debug, and you don't really want too much logic going on in your layout files, because you want to keep your code and your layouts a bit separate. So now that we have our layout file set up, let's take a look at actually one more thing we need to do before this click handler will work. So you remember in our status view holder, we had to set the status variable to our status. So that refers to this variable we created in our layout file, but we've introduced a new one called handler. So when we go to bind, we also need to call the binding.setHandler on this new click handler that we've created. And once we've done that, we have this functionality here where it will show the layout based on if a status has a quoted status, and show us our snack bar when we actually click on the status. And next we're going to take a look at actually showing the quoted status when you click on this layout, as well as one of the more powerful features of the data binding library and the model view Viewmodel pattern, which is the underlying Viewmodel changing will actually update our views for us without us having to write any code for it. So let's take a look at that next. So as I mentioned, one of the very powerful features of data binding is the ability to update your view based on underlying model changes. And we're going to be doing that in this example using something called an observable field. So you can see we've added a new variable here called observable field status. It's going to use a status type as a parameter, and we've got our observable quoted status variable now. So when we create our status object, it's going to set up this new observable field. And we've got a couple methods that will act on this field. We have a way to update our quoted status, and that's going to set the quoted status to our observable field. And once this happens, it's actually going to be changing our view that is displayed. And we also have a way to clear the quoted status of the observable field. So let's take a look now at the marshaller and see how we're handling this quoted status. So when we marshal our Twitter4j objects, we're going to check to see if this status does have a quoted status. If it does, we're going to marshal that quoted status into our status Viewmodel object, and then we're going to create a new status that includes this quoted status. And now let's take a look at the click handler. It's actually going to be handling showing or hiding this view. So You notice we're not actually touching any views here to display or hide them. All we need to do is update our observable, and the data binding will take care of displaying or hiding views based on some logic that we have in our status item layout file, which we'll get to in a second. So basically, if the quoted status is currently null when you click this, it's going to set the quoted status using this update quoted status function that we created, and this will set our quoted status. And once that happens, our views will be displayed. And then when you click again, it's going to hide the views by clearing our quoted status out of our observable. So let's take a look at the layout file and see what this looks like in the layout to actually hide or show these views. So it's pretty similar to what we did with the tap to load tweet text. It's going to look at this field in our status object to see if it has an observable quoted status. So when we click our click handler, it's going to update the quoted status observable to be the new quoted status. And when that happens, this will actually show these views. And we have this set up for all the views here. So basically now we have a way to update our views based on the underlying data changing. So based on setting this observable status to the quoted status or null, our views will update dynamically. And this is one of the very powerful parts of the view model design, is that you can now update your views based off the underlying data model changing and not manually hiding or showing views in code. So let's take a look at our demo app now and see what this looks like. As you can see here, this is the expanded quoted tweet here. If we click it again, it will hide. And if we click it, it will show these views. Now when we're clicking this, it's setting that status to null in our observable, which causes the views to hide. Then when we click it again, it's going to set that status in the observable to be the quoted status, which will show our views. Another benefit of the view model pattern is the fact that it makes it easy to test your view models without actually needing a view to test it on. So because the data binding library acts as a go-between from your view model and your actual view itself, you've separated the view model code from the view. So if you needed to test updating a view model object and making sure that the data was updated correctly, you can now write tests for that view model without actually needing a view to interact with and check the correct functionality that way. So that's another very nice feature of using this pattern, is it makes it much easier to test your view model code without needing to actually get involved with a view itself. Alright, that's going to conclude this Friday afternoon training session on the Android data binding library and model view view model pattern. If you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to me. As I said, this test project is available on my GitHub. I've also included resources to the blog that I got this code from and learn a little bit more about the pattern. I've also included a link to the Android developer documents on the data binding library. I hope you've enjoyed and have a good day.